bit of a change of pace with this lecture because I'm moving from very general discussions to discuss a book, namely Marx's Capital. Now, it'll help you a lot if you've read Capital. I simply can't deliver this and really explain all the concepts that are coming up in Capital as I go. So if you haven't read Capital, some parts of this will be a little bit more challenging for you. If you've read Capital, I hope that you will get more out of it. So in 1914, coming to the end of his study of Hegel's logic, Lenin wrote in the margin, "It is impossible to completely understand Marx's Capital, especially its first chapter, having thoroughly studied and understood the whole of Hegel's logic." Consequently, half a century later, none of the Marxists understood Marx. It was indeed Lenin who first noticed this connection. 100 years later, Haymarket published a volume in which 12 Marxists each gave a different account of the basis for Lenin's aphorism. Only two things that all 12 agreed upon. The first was that Marx provided the basis for the connection in his 1858 essay, The Method of Political Economy, and in particular that this essay constituted a synopsis of Hegel's logic. I provided a link to this essay in the text, hoping that you'll read the essay for yourself. The essay sketches the historical development of any science, but political economy in particular. The science can be represented in terms of three phases, which I will describe like this. Firstly, as a result of prior development of the science and of the practices and technology based on this prior development, the science has gathered a mass of data, such as the population, the output of various industries, wages, working hours, prices, and so on. When the researcher settles down to work, this data is already available. There is, at first at least, no chance of collecting different data, but this data constitutes one image of reality. It is an image rich in detail, but poor in conceptual form. Each item taken on its own is relatively meaningless. If you have been paying attention, you will know that this is the stage of development of the science of a concrete concept of the subject matter, which Hegel calls being. It is the precondition and background to the development of any science. Marx begins, "It seems to be correct to begin with the real and the concrete, with the real precondition, and thus to begin in economics with, for example, the population, which is the foundation and the subject of the entire social act of production." But then Marx continues, "However, on closer examination, this proves to be false. The population is an abstraction if I leave out, for example, the classes of which it is composed. These classes in turn are empty phrases if I am not familiar with the elements on which they rest. For example, wage labor, capital, etc. These latter in turn presuppose exchange, division of labor, prices, etc. Thus, if I were to begin with the population, this would be a chaotic conception of the whole, and I would then, by means of further determination, move analytically towards ever more simple concepts, from the imagined concrete to ever thinner abstractions until I had arrived at the simplest determinations." Here Marx encapsulates the logically next phase of the development of the science. It is the analytical phase. It is represented in reality by the theoretical work of all his predecessors in the science. In Marx's analysis, it is represented in the decades of labor and stacks of notebooks in which he engaged in a critique of political economy. Marx approached political economy then not just as an objective economic process or as a mass of data, but as a body of theory. Like the data produced in the phase of being, it is an ideal object. In this ideal movement, Marx, like his predecessor, is able to trace the contradictions in successive attempts to grasp the data of political economy and represent it in conceptual form, each contradiction disclosing its ground in a deeper contradiction. If you've been paying attention, you will recognize this process as the phase of essence in Hegel's logic. And the outcome, the product of essence, is a new concept, or rather, as the analytical process continues down the generations, a series of such concepts. These concepts are concrete abstractions. All of the concepts which appear in theories are, of course, abstractions. But whereas the raw data are very thin abstractions, rich in content but bare in conceptual form, the abstractions which come out of the process of analysis are concrete abstractions because each contains interrelations of all kinds between masses of data. Excuse me. Marx then says, from there, the journey would have to be retraced until I had finally arrived at the population again, but this time not as a chaotic conception of the whole, but as a rich totality of many determinations and relations. The former is the path historically followed by economics at the time of its origins. The economists of the 17th century, for example, always begin with the living whole, the population, nation, state, several states, etc. But they always conclude by discovering, through analysis, a small number of determinate abstract general relations, such as division of labor, money, value, etc. And as soon as these individual moments have been more or less firmly established and abstracted, there began the economic systems, which ascended from the simple relations, such as labor, division of labor, need, exchange value, to the level of the state, exchange between nations in the world market. And summing up, he says, along the first path, the full conception was evaporated to yield an abstract determination. Along the second, abstract determinations lead towards the reproduction of the concrete by way of thought. The second phase of Marx's work is thus the writing of Capital, beginning with the simplest determinations, the concrete abstractions, and reconstructing the whole, but now not as a dumb series of economic data, but as a conceptual whole, a comprehensive science of political economy. This conceptual whole does not have the same scope as the sensual whole from which the science began. Capital did not include a theory of the state or the family or of civil law or history. It was based on an abstraction. Economic activity was abstracted from the wider social context. The resulting concept therefore differs from the whole, which was the starting point. The young Marx, who resigned from journalism to take up the study of political economy, had been more concerned with state repression and censorship than exploitation of wage labor, and capital would represent only one aspect of the concrete world which produced the original economic data. The essay Method of Political Economy was written in 1858 and has been published as part of the Grundrisse. A year later, Marx published Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which is often described as the first draft of Capital. In the interval, Marx has made a correction to this synopsis. Capital will not begin with a small number of abstract general concepts, but with one, namely value. A further development in Marx's thinking took place in that year. The 1858 essay had nothing to say about the commodity relation, and yet, and this is the second point that all the Marxists referred to agreed upon, Marx begins Capital not from the concept of value as such, but from an analysis of the commodity, the simplest social form of value. In the preface to the first German edition, he says, in bourgeois society, the commodity form of the product of labor, or value form of the commodity, is the economic cell form. In 1881, he further clarified, I do not start out from the concept of value. What I start out from is the simplest social form in which the labor product is presented in contemporary society, and this is the commodity. And the opening words of Capital itself confirm this. The wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails, presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. An investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of a commodity. Here Marx made a further step in bringing himself into line with Hegel's logic. In Hegel's encyclopedia, each science begins with a one, alternatively called a germ cell or a unit. The single abstract entity, which is the simplest social form of the concept given to natural consciousness, which, although marking the starting point of the science, presupposes nothing about that science. Any member of modern capitalist society will understand perfectly well what a commodity is, a product of labor which you can swap for something else. The only presupposition entailed in this first concept is human beings engaged in production for exchange. Value, on the other hand, is an abstraction in the same sense that activity or being are abstractions, in that they can only be understood from the standpoint of this or that theory. Only when a unit has been determined, commodities or activities, is there an entry point in the natural consciousness of a given society. Only then do we have a starting point for a synthetic science, for the synthetic reconstruction of the whole economy. The only two things agreed by all 12 writers was the importance of these two passages from Marx, beginning with what the significance of these two passages were and everything else flowing from there. Nothing else was agreed, but I continue. Where Marx goes with the analysis of the commodity is well known. He shows that the very concept of commodity as the substance and unit of value has an irreconcilable contradiction within it. On the one hand, the commodity is a product of a certain concrete quality of labor meeting some need. And on the other, it is a product of a certain quantity of social labor. Marx proceeds by analyzing this contradiction to find its ground. Now, a fact which almost no one has noticed is that this method, determining a simple unit of some economic concept given to natural consciousness and analyzing it to disclose the internal contradiction it's contained, is repeated multiple times throughout Volume 1 of Capital. Lacking explicit clues from Marx himself, few people have noticed this rather obvious fact about capital. I mean, I should say no one. Marx explores commodities and exchange, including labor power, as a commodity for 35 pages before he introduces money in the form of gold, and a further 68 pages before the words buy and sell appear. And he leaves paper money and other forms of credit till much later. So the whole of part 1, 112 pages, is confined entirely to the commodity form, with money and labor power figuring as kinds of commodity. If, on the other hand, Marx has begun with money, as it appears in modern consciousness, then political economy would have remained a mystery, as it would remain a mystery why a coin or a banknote had value. Monies that appeared in the capitalist society of Marx's time could not be drawn into the analysis until much later in the conceptual reconstruction of the whole. Now, this is the interesting part. Part 2 of Capital begins with a new concept, capital. Marx abstracts capital from the circulation of commodities on the market. C for commodity, M for money, right? C, M, etc., in which a single unit is CMC, that is, a person selling a commodity in order to acquire money to buy the commodity they need. No new value appears in this process of exchange of equivalents, but a new unit emerges in this infinite procession simply by beginning with buying instead of beginning with selling, MC, M dash, that is, buying a commodity in order to sell it at a profit. Whereas CMC represents the activity of a worker, CMC dash represents a capitalist firm. This is the unit of capital, the individual capitalist firm. Simple. A concept already well known to natural consciousness, now appearing as merely one cycle in the circulation of commodities. but one which begins with having money to buy rather than beginning with having only labour power to sell. At this point, it still remains a mystery, however, how new value arises from the circulation of commodities simply by beginning with money rather than labour power. Marx's next move is brilliant. In part 3, he explores the buying and selling of labour power, leading to the discovery that the labour time required to produce the equivalent of one day's labour power was less than one day's labour. Thus arises the concept of necessary labour time and so surplus labour time, a new unit. Labour time discloses a contradiction within it, necessary labour and surplus labour over and above the value of wages. He evokes the idea of a worker reproducing the equivalent of their own needs and then continuing to work. This unpaid surplus labour time, which the worker provides every day, is the unit of surplus value. This is the third unit Marx has drawn into his analysis: commodity, capitalist firm, and surplus labour time. Workers would already be aware that selling the products of their labour is the source of the capitalist profit, but the source of this surplus had always been mystified. The idea of unpaid labour time connects immediately with natural consciousness, including pre-capitalist forms of consciousness. Marx's examination of commodities has demonstrated that it is consistent with the obvious fact that labour power is a commodity worth more to use than it costs to produce. In the next chapter, Marx introduces the ideas of constant and variable capital, and thus the contradiction between relative and absolute surplus value. On this basis, he gets rate of profit, although this is a very different concept from what goes by the same name in bourgeois economics. Notice the way Marx introduces a new concept at each stage, each arising only from what has already been established so far, just the same way that Hegel built his logic. None of the categories Marx produces, at least in the first volume of Capital, can be identified in the actual prices and rates of profit found in a real capitalist economy. None of it makes economic sense at all until Marx gets to the third volume of Capital, after dealing with the circulation of capital. But capital was never intended as a handbook for making profit. Its aim was to establish the source of surplus value in unpaid labour time and to explore the deep-seated contradictions in the bourgeois economic formation. It is much an exploration of bourgeois ethics and the class structure of modern society as a work of economic science. Over and above the method of identifying at each stage of the synthesis a new unit, analysing the contradiction in that unit, drawing in new units to resolve successive contradictions. There is one other connection with Hegel's logic, which is equally profound. There's another parallel between the logic and capital, which requires me to skip over about 500 pages of Capital to show you, but it is important enough to pay special attention to. As I've said, the unit of capital is a capitalist firm, the concrete unit, given to natural cognition, a form of activity, not a group of people. Marx chooses this definition rather than saying simply that capital is a form of value, or, for example, a sum of money for the purchase of means of production, which is the formal definition of capital. According to the formal definition of capital, capital is just a sum of money. It is a flat abstraction, the sum of money standing over against the unit of productive material that it represents. This conception of capital can never be compared to the formal conception of this conception of capital can be compared to the formal conception of a concept as a mental image representing a real object. It is purely quantitative, one-dimensional. Hegel's conception of a concept was a concrete concept in that it is essentially the unity of three moments, universal, particular, and individual. In the logic, Hegel introduces this as three distinct units and then internally develops them through their interrelations. Marx's concept of capital is also a concrete concept. Money can be capital only by being repeatedly withdrawn from circulation and then brought back into circulation again, realizing a profit. Capital ceases to be capital unless it constantly renews itself. As a result of its entry into the circulation of commodities, a unit of capital also enters into the circulation of capital, where it finds itself in competition with other units of capital. In the first place, the different individual units of capital compete in the same marketplace for the same products and the same labor. As a result, capital moves from the less to the more profitable units, driving down the costs of production and driving innovation in the relevant forces of production. Thus, every individual capital is also a unit of the particular capital, particular in the sense of competing in a particular kind of labor product. Incidentally, the same process affects the sellers of a particular kind of labor power. But further, because of the varying organic composition of capital, that is the differing ratio of constant and variable capital, the profit rate varies from one particular kind of labor to another. And as a result, capital flows from one particular industry to another particular industry. This is universal capital, the activity constituting the capitalist class as a whole. Likewise, abstract labor will flow into the industries offering the best living. The formal conception of capital only allows for unmediated, universal and individual forms, Cartesian images of one another, and consequently could not theorize the movement of capital around an economy which produces a uniform rate of profit, despite the fact that a uniform rate of profit is inconsistent with a uniform rate of surplus value, which is guaranteed by an economy in which there is free movement of abstract labor. Marx goes to great trouble to elaborate this concrete, sharp-eyed concept of capital, to such an extent that he died before he got to write the second and third volumes of Capital and had to leave that task to Engels. But without the second volume, which deals with the circulation of capital, and the third volume, which draws together the first and second volumes and reconciles the rate of surplus value with the uniform rate of profit, capital is counterfactual, notwithstanding the very down-to-earth and concrete way Marx introduces his concepts. Now, self-evidently, Capital is a very different book from Hegel's logic. Not so much because of the differences in the personalities of the two authors, but in their subject matter. In each of Hegel's books, the form of movement is different. Self-evidently, when the subject matter is capital, the way the concepts unfold in the synthesis is going to be different than if the subject matter is conceptual logic. The relation between the two is in the way the argument begins at each stage of its elaboration with a unit. The choice of this unit determines how the exposition will unfold from there. It is itself a product of analysis and arises from a critical reworking of the history of the given science. The second significant relation between the logic and capital is that both produce concrete rather than formal concepts of their subject matter. The process of analysis is complicated by the fact that the subject matter of analysis, the concept which the science aims to shed light on, is not the starting point of the analysis. This in two ways. In order to reveal to us what a concept is, Hegel had to begin with being, and the concept arises as the third book of the logic. Secondly, being proved to be a mere abstraction, as did essence. A unit had to be determined in each case before a concrete unit for the concept logic could be determined. Likewise, in writing a book on capital, a definite and historically unique form of society, Marx had to determine the concept of value. Capital was, after all, just one form of value. And secondly, he had to have the insight into what the unit of value was, that's commodity. From there, he could go on to derive capital and the unit of capital, a capitalist firm. There never has been in history any such thing as a society of commodity exchange. The idea arises as the logical presupposition of capital, but pure commodity production only arises when capital has already become the dominant relation in society. I emphasize this connection between Hegel's logic and Marx's capital because the methodological symmetry between them, as I've presented it to you, can be utilized in the analysis of any complex process. There are homologies between logic and economics which are unique to this relation, but I have not focused on these. What is most important is how Marx produced concrete concepts of the capitalist class and the working class. The advantage of reading the logic mediated by a reading of Capital is that Marx has shown us very clearly how apparently abstract and intangible concepts can be represented in their simplest social form. This process is hidden under too many layers of abstraction in Hegel to be easily discernible. But Hegel demonstrates the idea dozens and dozens of times throughout the encyclopedia. Marx demonstrates the idea in only one science, the analysis of 19th century capitalism, but he does this job much more effectively than Hegel did when he turned his mind to analysing economics, and understandably so, because Marx wrote in Britain in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, and Hegel wrote in an economic and social backwater in early 19th century. So Hegel's logic's not a model for any part of Capital. Hegel's logic demonstrates some very basic methodological principles which are emulated by Marx and should be emulated by all of us when we try to understand any complex phenomenon, such as the present conjuncture in the political and social crisis of our country, and any more localized or restricted novel problem. Okay, questions?
Okay, not really a question, but just an observation, particularly as I was discussing with people in our group. Because the whole idea, particularly throughout the series about looking for the one, that simplest unit, and then building up to it, looking for the contradiction and building up to another unit and another and another until you get wherever it is you're going. There's an analog of that in neoclassical economics. Now, so obviously this isn't Marxist in any way, but the idea, the main difference that I noticed is that in Marxist economics, the simplest or that base unit, elemental unit that they're looking at is the commodity as a social relation, while in neoclassical economics, the unit is a person, an atomistic being that has particular characteristics that optimizing, calculating, that kind of stuff. And so they have average characteristics about them that make them instrumental like atoms. So you can formally deduce their whatever it is they're supposed to do based on those actions.
Utilitarian ethics is bourgeois political economy translated into the language of ethics, right?
Yeah, and that's the main difference that I've seen, and not just actually in Marx, but also in some other more heterodox types of economists, because they're looking at things in terms of social relations instead of atomistic beings that can be formally explained.
Yeah, exactly. See, the general rules there are drawn not like it's not so much advice for a thinker, they're observations of how sciences actually develop, right? And so what Marx then does, and Hegel, is understanding this is how it works. They proceed with that full knowledge, they proceed systematically, rather than having a different idea about how science moves. But secondly, as you point out, the choice of that starting point makes all the difference. I think I used Foucault as an example earlier on. That initial conception, if you see the world as a system of social control, then you build a certain theory about that world, right? If you see it as fundamentally exchanging commodities, then you build a different way. Now, Marx didn't see the world as exchange of commodities. He saw a definite social formation, which he'd call simply a market. right? But the choice of that starting point, and that's the analytical phase, which requires analyzing the thinking, the work that's been going on already, and getting into it and saying, this is the starting point, right? So that process is much more difficult to describe than the process of the synthetic reconstruction. Anyway, Pauline.
Would you say that with a lot of sciences, things can tend to be quite stuck in the being or essence phase, or the analysis phase? I'm just asking because I've noticed at different times you've had a bit of a critique of sociology, for example, and I'm asking that because I did my PhD in sociology, and I kind of tend to agree at times, like I did qualitative research, that at times it can be stuck in that analytic phase where it's a lot of description, bringing together sources of data, identifying themes, and maybe applying or generating some theory. But for example, it's different to another field that I did my undergrad in, which was public health, which grasped things a bit differently. It linked social formations and class society directly to inequalities in health. There was a bit more of a grasping of things. I don't know. But yeah, it's maybe a weird question, but I was really interested in those phases.
No, not at all. I would say you can't say this about sciences in general today. If you take biology, at the time Hegel was writing, biology was still completely in the phase of just collecting data. And what's his name? The Scandinavian Swedish guy who did a taxonomy. What's his name? I always forget his name. Chain of taxonomy, different types of creatures. Anyway, that's what they had. You know, things with 4 legs, things with lungs, you know, things with scales, things with backbones, and they arranged them all in groups and so on, and hierarchies. So that was very strictly in the phase of biology, in its phase of simply data collection, being, right? Quantities and qualities. But after Hegel's death, although they had a concept of cells, because they didn't have microscopes that were sufficiently strong, they couldn't see cells. But during the 1830s, the microscope developed to a point where they could see the minuscule life going on at a tiny level, and they introduced the concept of a cell. And that then when you had, in the 1850s, Darwin's theory of evolution, that's to say that offspring differ from their parents. So you have a process of natural selection, which was based on organisms made up of cells. And then I think nowadays we have a concept of an ecosystem. Biologists go ahead and say, I've got an ecosystem here. What are the organisms that make up that? Now, you couldn't ask for anything more, really, of a science to develop that 3 layers of cell, organism, and ecosystem. And of course, I was talking to my niece, who's a wildlife ecologist, and apparently there are units below cell which are important too, but that basic structure is there. It's in the nature of the human sciences to have difficulty in its development because it's so riven with ideology and everything is contested. I mean, you can just give the reasons for what you like, but some of you have a copy of my book, Origins of Collective Decision Making, and that's a book where I applied what I learned from Hegel and Marx to analysis of politics. So I asked myself, what's the basic unit of politics? It's a group of people making a collectively binding decision. So then, well, to understand that, I had to, anyway, so the story goes on from there. You look at you take the environmental crisis, the condition of Australia today, then you're going to be doing that. And in those human areas, you're really starting from way back, right? Because something like traditional sociology, although Abet's pointed to similarities, and there will be, it isn't really still at the stage of biology was in 1800, but to a great extent it still is. Yeah. Michael.
Yeah, hi Andy. I wanted to follow up on the last question I asked, because I think in some way you answered it in your last presentation, but I just want to double check that and see what you think, maybe for clarity's sake. So when you're discussing capital and Marx's analysis of value, would that be an instance of Marx critiquing like using Hegel's system to critique a universal kind of conceptual norm, or like an ideal? Like, would value be the instance of that within the concept of Das Kapital, do you think?
Yeah, value is an ideal. There's a very good essay called On the Concept of the Ideal by a Russian called Evgeny Dulyenkov, of the concept of the ideal. It's worth reading. It's an ideal, so it's only meaningful as a product of forms of human activity, right? So it doesn't really make a suitable starting point. So how can you make an ideal a starting point? Yeah, so the value arises when one thing is compared to another, and you need a real comparison. That is to say, not a hypothetical comparison, an actual comparison, right? So, for example, people who like relativism, which is all of us, of course, say, oh, you can't say one country is better than another. Okay, but every day people are making the choice and leaving one country and going to another. They might then, when they get old, say, oh, I wish I was back in my days of my youth, and they go home again, right? Because one country might be good for making a living or having a career as a sports person or finding a way of not getting shot. Whereas, value requires some measure or some dimension on which things can be compared, right? Now that dimension is called value. And, I'm not axiology is the ethics of values, right? I'm not a great fan of axiology, because values implies which do you prefer, this or that. And I think that's not a sound basis for ethics. So instead of trying to, yes, value was a norm or an ideal, but Marx had to get to below it in the form of human activity, which is reflected in value, exchange of commodities. So its unit is a single exchange of commodities. Okay. Anything else? Go on, Abet. You've got a question, I bet. No?
Well, not really a question. But again, it's part of that theme that's been running through the series about starting from, say, a hole, going down, finding out you're wrong. There's in truth, falsity, and then eventually going back. And the way it was described here, it really just meshes in with pretty consistent with that idea.
Good. Although I attribute the idea to Hegel, Hegel got it from Goethe, right? In Goethe's naturalism, or what do you call it, morphology, he's the first person to formulate the idea, and he called it an Urphänomen, but that's to say an elementary form or appearance. And Hegel credits him. There's a letter where he writes to Goethe appreciating that insight. Oh, we've still got a few minutes.
Could I just jump in there? Just the line where you said like you shouldn't understand capital as a science of economics, or as much as it's a science of economics. It's about bourgeois ethics and class structure. I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, funnily enough, about the same time as getting this thing going, that's right. When I prepared this essay, the one we just talked about, I sent a message to a fellow called Fred Mosley, who it was in discussion. He was one of the 12, in fact, one of the editors of that book with 12 Marxists. And I thanked him for the idea about universal and particular. But I just said, but by the way, you can't have two moments and not the third. And so we had a little discussion. In the end, he agreed it was pointless taking the discussion any further because I didn't regard Marxist economics as a theorist endeavor, and that was his whole life. So got to accept there wasn't much of a basis for talking. If you're going to read Marx to understand economics, up to a point gives you certain insights. But if I want to know whether house prices are going to go up and down, quite honestly, I'll listen to one of the, country's economists, KPMG or something. I won't find the answer in Capital. Now, of course, Capital, because it goes right to the fundamentals, gives you some insights into the way the economy works, which completely escapes the understanding of people that work on that superficial level based on supply and demand, right? But I'm going to put it, the Marx stopped writing, when he died in 1883. The capitalism just got going at that point. Taylorism, comes in just after Marx is dead. Ford is a bit after that. Keynes, Toyota, Facebook, and so on. Right? The capitalist economy is so different than what it was that trying to use Marx's ideas to actually get economic insights, like to know whether house prices are going up and down, is no good. But you can get certain things. For example, the idea that defending the length of the working day is a baseline for employees. That's right. And Sally Rugg has just, taken what's the name to court over that one, because that's the basic root of how making you work longer than you needed to and taking the product remains the basic way you accumulate capital. But, it's just so different now. It's so different, that's all. As Ronnie says, wage theft is alive and well, but it does tell you about bourgeois economics based in exchange, doing deals. And capital is based all on the assumption, actually not of wage theft, but that things are always exchanged as equivalents. Okay, there were people that break the law and rip you off, but generally speaking, things are exchanged at their value. And that's why how people make a profit is a mystery, because capitalists think I make a profit because I buy cheap and sell expensive, right? But that doesn't make sense, because every capitalist can't buy cheap, sell expensive. That's just, it all comes out in the wash. They're all ripping each other off. You don't get any profit accumulated at a societal level by everyone ripping each other off. So that insight into bourgeois, I won't remember his name, but there was I can't remember his name. He wrote a book entirely reading Capital as a work of ethics. Now, understand, where did bourgeois ethics come from? Well, what's his name? Jesus, Smith. His first book was Principles of Moral Philosophy. And then 20 years later, it comes out with Wealth of Nations. The Principles of Moral Philosophy were simply translated into economic terms. So bourgeois economics, which Marx is critiquing, going to go under it, finding out its basis, is an expression of bourgeois ethics. Ethics simply meaning how we should live. Yeah, you pay things. You do favors for each other. You make deals. You stick to your agreements, right? You don't break agreements. You expect to be paid the worth of what you sell and to buy what you buy for its value, right? And on that basis, that's how you get to be a wealthy person, because the labor power is a wonderful thing. You pay it for what it costs to produce, and then you reap a profit, right? So bourgeois ethics gives you the basics for understanding economics, but the rules of the game have been so changed in the 150 years since Marx wrote Capital that you can't expect to find really sound economics there. You have to, unfortunately, rely on people that are really doing magic stuff, quite honestly. But because, like say, take a stockbroker, he does not understand how the stock exchange generates profits. Impossible to explain. With Marx's analysis, you can understand how the stock market, creates capital, right? It doesn't create capital; it channels it from one industry, from industry or agriculture into finance, right? But if I wanted to know what would be a good investment, I'm not going to consult Marx. I'm going to find a good stockbroker. The guy doesn't understand it. So in Hegelian terms, he understands it, but he doesn't have speculative logic. Dirk's smiling. This is Hegel represents two different kinds of thinking. Understanding means you know how the system works, right? You know the rules of the game, and you can be very good at it, right? But you don't have any idea where it came from and where it's going to. That's called what Hegel calls speculative logic. Right?
Can I just put in there,
yeah, go
Andy,
on.
you're not broken by it either. Like, you want the stockbroker who thinks that it's a good, fair system and that you can make a good buck out of it. Yeah. Because otherwise, he's not going to be able to play the game for you properly.
That's right. It's good. It's no good being a socialist stockbroker, really. Okay. Look, next week, I'm making a complete break. The first lecture is going to be about contemporary politics. And I spent 20 years sort of in relative isolation doing this theoretical stuff. And so, although I have a lifetime of in the union movement, social movements, and so on, I'm not just a theoretical person, but I will stand to be corrected here and there in what I say next week. But I'm trying to introduce a critical approach. Oh, you'll miss that, Rachel. Don't worry. It'll be recorded within the day and you'll get to see it. And you can even send me an email telling me how wrong I was as well. This is good. So I'll see you all next week.